Okay, for the AP test, for all of the countries that we study, you need to know the following six things. So, head of state, you need to know the head of government, and for each of those positions, you should know what positions constitute each of those, as in the Queen in the United Kingdom for the head of state, and the president in Russia, and so on and so forth. For both of them, you should know which person holds each position in each country at this particular moment in time. Who are the key figures we've talked about in recent times as well, and certainly the selection methods and term length and limit and so forth. Same goes for the lower house and upper house. You should know the names of each body of the legislatures in the countries that we study, along with the dominant party in the lower house of the countries that in fact do have bicameral legislatures. You should know selection methods for all the houses. You should know term lengths and limit as well, and kind of what the evolution has been as far as the power structure goes. Federal or unitary seem straightforward. You need to know that the three federal states are Russia, Nigeria, and Mexico, and the other three are the unitary systems. You should also know the trends over the course of time that have taken place, as in Mexico being very centralized in its federalism under the PRI, becoming more decentralized in the era of multi-party Mexico, whereas in a country like Britain, with its unitary system, they've become more decentralized with devolution. And a political system standpoint, remember just to name that as the system that it is, and I think sometimes you screw up the meaning of that. The UK as a parliamentary system, Russia as semi-presidential, China as a one-party communist state, Iran as a theocratic republic, Mexico and Nigeria as presidential systems. Political socialization is the first term we started with in class, and we did so for a reason. It is central to all things that we do, along with political culture. You do need to know the definition, as it is stated right there. It's how our attitudes and values are shaped and formed in a society in terms of politics. Remember that we talked about there being many different facets of the political self. When you talk about how you were raised, what's your belief in ideology, your sense of nationalism, patriotism, your knowledge of current events, and so forth, all of that matters. We talked about direct and indirect political socialization. Remember that most things are indirect as far as how people get socialized. Indirect means that it is something you have experienced or lived through. It is not directly taught to you, so most socialization is in fact indirect. Remember that it does evolve and it is ongoing, and it will be for the rest of your lives. And then the main agents that we talked about on day one, things like social media, the mass media, your peer groups, religion, your school, and those types of things are all critical players there. From a political culture standpoint, baseline definition, remember, is that it is the collection of attitudes and beliefs about politics in a particular society. And you should know, again, for all of the countries, how on the previous slide, how socialization takes place, and on this slide, what is the political culture in a country, and how has it been shaped, and how has it changed in recent years. We talked about consensual versus conflictual a long time ago. Remember that consensual culture means that one side believes in the legitimacy of the other, even if they are on the losing side of things, whereas in a conflictual culture, the losing side does not see the legitimacy in the opponent and may seek to upend the system on the whole via uprisings and so on. Political culture of itself is evident on multiple levels. We talked about the policy expectations of people. In the United Kingdom, for instance, the notion that the United Health or the National Health Service, is what the expectation is. People expect to have nationalized health care in that regard. It is not the policy expectation in the United States. How the government ought to operate, how leaders ought to behave, citizens should participate. Those things are going to be very different in the United Kingdom versus China. Legitimacy, we talked about the definition. Of course, you have to know it. Remember that it is the people's belief in the government's right to rule, and it is obtained in a number of ways, and we've referenced all of these pretty strongly throughout the semester. Historical tradition and longevity is one way to get it. Charismatic leadership, which could include that cult of personality, is another. Rational legal rule, when you have open elections and transparency, the rule of law. Economic well-being. Think about the Chinese and think about how their legitimacy has been fostered since 1978. If the people long-term are satisfied with the state's overall performance and responsiveness, you're going to have a high degree of legitimacy. And sometimes governments and states will foster nationalism, or foster legitimacy through nationalism, which we have seen in a number of our authoritarian states, especially in this course. The rule of law, as just mentioned, just because it's a term that is so vital, remember that it means that no one's above the law, that the law does apply to all, the laws are transparent, they are consistently enforced, and that the public does have access to see not only how laws are developed and created, but how they're applied as well. And remember that the rule of law being very, very strong in liberal democracies, we hope, and very weak in authoritarian states, and the rule of law probably being non-existent in a failed state. We talked about big terms, state and nation, regime and government. Those are critical, and you have to recall that you will do those according to their real poli-sci definition. So nation is people. Don't think that it's anything else. It's people with the psychological link that binds them together based on something. You've had the course now, so you know the Uyghurs are a nation, the Chechens are a nation, the Scottish are a nation. That's present in every country that we study. We talk about the others. Government is the people. It is the leadership in charge of running the state at a particular moment in time. Remember, the government is not institutions. The government is people, and we talked about it being very specifically the head of government and the cabinet, the head of government and the cabinet. And as that is the case, the government is weakly institutionalized as the leaders change, and the government is in fact limited by the existing regime because of the rules that the regime does put forth and adhere to. Speaking of the regime, there it is. It is the institutions and practices enduring from one government to the next. Remember that regime is not people. It is the rules, institutions, and practices that a state has to set and follow, and the practices that endure from one government to the next. The regime is very strongly institutionalized, can be changed via revolution or other major events, oftentimes but not always embodied in a constitution. But remember, think about what the regime is. In Russia, the regime includes a presidency as head of state. It is presidential elections every 6 years, 2 consecutive 6-year terms for the head of state in the Russian Federation. Those things are part of the Russian regime. And keep in mind, remember, those are not people. The state on the whole, remember that it is the organization that possesses sovereignty. That is, it exercises legal power over a given population within defined borders. It uses the political institutions to generate and carry out policy. Things like the legislature and the judiciary, the army, the police, the bureaucracy, anything that is generating and carrying out policy, anything that is part of the regime, that is part of the structure, like I said, the court system, all part of the state. The state is highly institutionalized. The state can also constitute people, which in that case not strongly institutionalized, but the state institutions themselves are. And like I said, the state does in fact possess sovereignty. Federal and unitary states you need to be very strong on, and it's a big definitional piece and understanding piece for the AP test. Remember that a federal system is one in which there is the notion that subnational units are granted considerable power, whereas in a unitary system you have subnational units granted little to no power. They both have elections. The College Board will try to throw you off about that. Remember that in a unitary system, you do have elections. Think about the United Kingdom. They have elections for the Mayor of London, elections for the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly, and what we talked about. And so don't get tripped up on that. Remember, decentralized policymaking, centralized policymaking, more power to the central government, and more power decentralized in a federal system. Federal advantages: it will help protect smaller groups, be they ethnic, linguistic, or religious. It allows for that accommodation of particularism as a result of that, because people can elect leaders to represent them at the local level. Policy making, in the laboratories of policy making, is an easy one nowadays. You can experiment with policy programs. Think Colorado and marijuana, and other states, but it's a good one to just remember that, if it's successful at a statewide level, then it can be picked up by other subunits and then potentially nationally. We talked about citizens being able to vote with their feet, being able to move to a different subunit if you don't enjoy a particular policy in your own. Training ground for politicians is big. In federal states, you have that notion where politicians can gain executive governing experience at the subnational level before they assume national office. Disadvantages in the federal system: remember that it's impossible to achieve nationwide standards. It's just not going to happen because subnational units are granted that power to direct funding and standards on the whole as far as education, healthcare, and because of that, citizens get systematically different treatments as a result of that, so those nationwide standards are truly impossible. Also, unitary systems in a better position to manage resources and not get caught up in the rigmarole of determining who's responsible for what from a subnational unit or national government or national state standpoint. Economically, we do need to have you understand the core differences between the free market, socialist or mixed systems, and command systems. Again, this stuff should be basic to you by now, but remember, the big core differences: in a free market, there is individual ownership of land and means of production and distribution. In a command system, all of that is done by the state. Supply and demand set the prices and so forth in the free market, whereas in a command system, bureaucrats do with 5-year plans and so on. And in a socialist system or mixed system, there is a combination of that private and public ownership. There is a mixture of nationalized and privatized industry, more emphasis on collective equality, not completely as the command system would try to engender, but certainly more so than the free market system. And remember these big terms down here, which again should be second nature: nationalization, the state taking over industry; privatization, individuals doing so; and public ownership, where industry is owned and operated by the state on behalf of the people; private ownership, owned by individuals.